They were 20 years old when the town decided they had to go. Not with a trial, not with a warning. Just a morning in the dead of winter when their uncle appeared at the door with 2 packs already loaded, his face set like stone, and the whole street watching from behind frosted windows. Brenna Vale looked at the faces of people she had known her entire life and understood something that would take years to stop hurting. Being right had always been the most dangerous thing about them. If you're watching this from wherever you are right now, drop your city in the comments below. Hit like and follow along because this story is one you need to see to the end. The morning it happened, Brenna was grinding dried corn at the kitchen table when she heard the knock. It wasn't really a knock, more of a fist against the door. 3 heavy blows, deliberate and final, the kind a man uses when he has already made up his mind about something and doesn't want to hear argument. She knew the sound of her uncle's fist. She had known it since she was 7 years old, and their mother was 3 months in the ground. Corin was still asleep, or pretending to be. That was one of the differences between them that nobody except Brenna ever noticed. Corin could go still as water when she sensed trouble coming, folding herself into silence while the storm gathered, while Brenna tended to walk straight into it with her eyes open and her jaw set. They were identical in every feature that could be seen. In most things that couldn't be seen, they were mirror opposite. Brenna set down the grinding stone and wiped her hands on her skirt. She opened the door. Her uncle Harlan Vale stood on the frozen step with 2 packs at his feet and 4 inches of new snow on his hat brim. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered past the point of reading. He had not always been unkind. She remembered from very early childhood a version of him that had laughed at the supper table, that had called her mother by a nickname too soft to repeat now. That man had stopped existing around the time he took responsibility for 2 small girls the town had already started whispering about. "Winter's bad," he said. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking somewhere to the left of her ear. "Worse than any I've seen in 30 years. There isn't enough in the stores for everyone." Brenna said nothing. The council met last night. Still not her face. 3 families have already lost children to the cold. There's talk the sickness is coming up from the lowlands. "I know," she said. "I told Elder Prent 2 weeks ago that the grain stores had been miscalculated. I showed him the numbers." Harlan's jaw tightened. "People don't like being shown numbers, Brenna. People are going to be hungry whether they like the numbers or not." "That," he stopped himself, breathed. "That is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about." He looked at the packs then, made himself look at them. She understood, watching his face, that this was not easy for him, and that it also was not difficult enough. "I packed what I could spare," he said. "Seeds from the fall stores, a skinning knife, 2 wool blankets, the small axe. Enough dried meat for 5 days if you're careful. And if we're not careful, then 3. She stared at him for a long moment. 20 years old, in a doorway, in the worst winter in living memory, with the whole street watching. She thought about saying something real, something that would crack through whatever he had built around himself to be able to stand on that step and do this. She thought about asking him if he remembered her mother's face, if he remembered the promise he made at the burial. She didn't ask either of those things. "Let me wake Corin," she said, and went back inside. Corin was not asleep. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with her boots already on and her coat across her lap, her dark eyes steady in the gray light coming through the ice-filmed window. She had heard every word. "How far?" she said. "Far enough that we don't come back." Corin looked down at the coat in her hands. For a moment, just a moment, her face did something complicated. Then she stood up and put the coat on. That was the thing about Corin that Brenna loved most and found most maddening. She made decisions completely and then kept them. No second guessing, no looking backward. Once she moved, she had already moved. Brenna spent a great deal of time second guessing, which was perhaps why she was better at planning and Corin was better at surviving. They came out together. They always came out together. Harlan was still standing on the step. The 4 neighbors who had arranged themselves on the street had not moved either. Mrs. Colburn with her arms folded over her chest, the Priestley brothers side by side like a matched pair of warped fence posts, and old Dag Holt leaning on his walking stick with an expression that was almost pity and mostly relief. These were people who had eaten bread that Brenna helped mill, who had taken her recommendations about crop rotation and then quietly credited the improvement to weather, who had brought their sick livestock to Corin in the dark hours when no one was watching. Brenna picked up one of the packs. It was heavier than she expected. Whatever else Harlan Vale was, he had packed it properly. Corin picked up the other. They did not say goodbye. There was not, at that moment, a goodbye in either of them. Corin looked at the four neighbors on the street, the way you look at a fence line you have already decided to go around. And Brenna looked at her uncle's face one last time. That worn, exhausted, somewhere to the left of honest face, and filed away the expression she found there, not for revenge, but because she wanted to remember exactly what it looked like when someone chose convenience over the thing they were supposed to be. Then they turned north, into the mountain, into the white. The storm hit them before they'd cleared the tree line. It had been building since dawn, that particular quality of silence that precedes a real blizzard, when the birds stop and the air goes tight and the snow, already on the ground, seems to brace itself. Brenna had noticed it at first light and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. The storm was coming regardless. They were going into it regardless. The trail north out of Dunmore Hollow ran along a creek bed for the first 2 miles before climbing sharply into the upper timber. In good weather, it was a serviceable path used by trappers and the occasional surveyor. In 2 feet of accumulated snow with fresh powder driving sideways out of the northwest, it was a series of guesses and corrections. Corin led. She had always had a slightly better instinct for terrain, some quality of attention that Brenna privately thought of as Corin reading the ground the way other people read faces. She moved without hesitation, even when hesitation would have been reasonable, planting each step like she was making a small commitment, and Brenna followed in her tracks and tried to think. She had a map. Technically, it was not her map. It had been among their mother's papers, a hand-drawn geological survey of the upper mountain range done by a man named Calder Voss, who had been contracted by a mining concern out of the Eastern Territories sometime in the early 1850s. The mining concern had apparently found nothing worth extracting and moved on, and the map had ended up folded into the back of one of her mother's agricultural notebooks. Brenna had read it approximately 40 times. She had a habit of reading things until they became part of her memory rather than something she needed to refer to, which had struck the people of Dunmore Hollow as deeply unnatural and struck Brenna as simply efficient. The map showed, among other geological features, a series of ravines in the upper northwest quadrant of the mountain range. One of them, marked with a notation she had puzzled over for years, was labeled Warm Rock Formation, limestone, possible geothermal. Calder Voss had been looking for ore. He had not been interested in warmth. But Brenna had spent 2 years thinking about what that notation might mean in practical terms, the way she tended to think about things that might someday matter, storing them in the back of her mind like provisions for a journey she hadn't known she'd be taking. She was taking it now. Northeast, she said over the wind, after the second ridge. Corin didn't slow down or turn around. You're sure? I'm sure of the notation. I'm not sure of the translation. That's honest, at least. It's also not very comforting. No, Corin agreed. Keep up. They walked for 6 hours. The storm thickened as they climbed, the wind changing direction twice, and the temperature dropping in a way that felt less like weather and more like a decision the mountain had made. Brenna lost feeling in her left hand around the 3rd hour and spent the next mile flexing it inside her mitten until sensation came back, painful and bright. Corin had a cut on her chin from a branch that had swung back off a snow-laden pine, and she kept wiping at it with the back of her hand in an absent-minded way, like she'd already moved past the fact of it. They talked sometimes. Not constantly. They'd never been the kind of sisters who needed to fill silence, but in patches, the way you do when the alternative is letting your own thoughts get too loud. Do you remember the time Papa's horse got into the grain shed? Corin said, during one of the longer flat stretches. You let it in, Brenna said. I didn't let it in on purpose. I was 7. You were 7, and you wanted to see if horses liked fermented grain. They do, incidentally. They like it a great deal. I know, I was there for the aftermath. Corin laughed. A short sound, more breath than voice, swallowed almost immediately by the wind. Papa was furious. He did that thing with his eyebrows. He had very expressive eyebrows for someone who didn't talk much. Mama laughed until she cried. She tried to hide it. She was terrible at hiding it. The silence after that had a different texture. Brenna let it sit. "I've been thinking," Corin said after a while. About? About the fact that neither of us cried back there. Brenna turned this over. Would it have changed anything? No, but it might have made us look less frightening. I was going to say unaffected. Corin glanced back at her. Though I suppose those might be the same thing to some people. We're not unaffected. I know, I'm just... She paused, picking her way around a buried deadfall. I keep trying to figure out which I am, angry or sad. I can't find the line between them right now. Brenna thought about her uncle's face on the step, the way he'd looked at the air beside her ear instead of her eyes, the way the packs had already been loaded when he arrived, which meant he'd packed them the night before, which meant he'd spent a night in the same house as them knowing what morning would bring. Both, she said. I think it's both. At the same time. That's the part no one ever tells you about. The first ridge was worse than she'd expected. The second was worse than the first. By the time they came down the far slope of the second ridge, the light had gone gray and flat in the way that meant maybe 2 hours before dark, and both of them were moving with the deliberate conservative pace that comes from real exhaustion. Not the theatrical kind that asks for sympathy, but the working kind that knows it has to continue regardless and allocates itself accordingly. Brenna pulled the map from her coat pocket. The paper was damp at the edges, despite the oilskin wrapping, and her fingers were clumsy with cold, but she could read it. She turned it against the light, matching what she remembered of the notation to the landscape ahead. The ravine should be here. Left, she said, down through those spruce. There should be a creek runoff. Corin stopped and looked at the trees. The spruce were old growth, enormous and black-barked, their lower branches buried under 5 feet of drifted snow, so that they rose from the white like columns in some abandoned structure. Between them, the ground dropped sharply. How sure are you? More than I was an hour ago. The rock formation here. She pointed to an exposed granite face 20 yards to the right. Matches what Voss drew on the survey. He was here. We're in the right place. But the ravine itself, I won't know until we're in it. Corin studied the spruce for another 3 seconds. Brenna watched her make her decision. Then we go in, she said. Oh, they almost missed it. The ravine entrance was not what Brenna had pictured. Not a dramatic opening in the earth, not a visible gap in the rock. It was a narrow slot between 2 limestone faces, half buried in snow, easy to walk past if you weren't looking for it specifically. Corin spotted it because she noticed a small detail that Brenna had missed. The snow in front of the slot was not settling in the same way as the snow around it. It was slightly less deep. Something beneath was affecting it. Heat, Corin said, and Brenna felt the word go through her like a match struck in a dark room. They pushed through the slot sideways, packs scraping stone, and the ravine opened around them. Not huge, maybe 40 feet wide at its broadest, with limestone walls rising 30 feet on either side, and a floor of compressed earth and old leaf matter that hadn't seen heavy snowfall. The snow that had entered was thin, patchy, and the air was different. Not warm exactly, not the warmth of a fire or a heated room, but the cold was reduced, modulated, like the difference between standing in a river and standing in a spring-fed pool. The walls held it. The earth below was doing something. Brenna dropped to one knee and pressed her bare hand. She had pulled the mitten off before she even thought about it, flat against the ground. It was not cold. The earth was not cold. She looked up at Corin, and Corin was already looking at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment because what was happening was large enough that words felt premature. You didn't narrate a miracle in progress. You made sure it was real first. Walk the perimeter, Brenna said. They walked it, both of them, separately, touching the walls, pressing palms to the stone, paying attention. The geothermal effect was not uniform. It was stronger toward the northern end of the ravine, where the limestone went deeper and the rock face had a faint mineral smell, sharp and clean, that Brenna associated with the earth's deeper layers. There was a natural shelf of stone, 10 feet wide and 15 feet long, along the west wall that would catch warmth from below and would face away from the prevailing wind. There was a depression in the earth near the northern end, below the warmest section of wall, where last summer's vegetation, dead now, but dense and matted, told her the growing season here extended beyond what it should for this elevation. And there was, tucked deep in the northern alcove where the limestone curved inward on itself, the mouth of a larger cave, barely visible. Brenna had to put her face close to the wall to see it properly. She reached back and grabbed Corin's sleeve without looking. "Here," she said. Corin leaned past her and looked into the dark. "How far back does it go?" "I don't know yet." They looked at each other. "We'll need fire to see," Corin said. "Yes. And if we make fire in there, we'll know very quickly whether the ventilation is adequate." Corin straightened up. She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment Brenna watched her sister's face do its characteristic thing, moving through the options, the risks, the calculations, without any of it showing much on the surface, just the slight tension around her eyes that Brenna had learned to read over 20 years of close attention. "Strike the fire," Corin said. "I'll watch the smoke." The flint and steel were in the bottom of Brenna's pack, wrapped in a square of dry leather that had kept them from the worst of the moisture. She built a small starter from the dry undersides of the leaf matter on the cave floor set. There was dry matter down there, preserved under the surface layer by the warmth coming up through the rock. And after 3 strikes, she had a flame. She held it up, watched the smoke. The smoke moved away from them, slowly, deliberately, drawn toward the back of the cave. "Ventilation," she said. "Natural," Corin said from behind her. "That's natural ventilation. There must be a secondary outlet further in. Fissure in the rock, probably. The warm air circulating." They stood in the mouth of the cave with the small fire guttering between them, and the cave went back further than the firelight could reach. Maybe 60 feet, maybe more. The ceiling high enough to stand upright in, the floor rough but walkable. The walls were dry. The limestone had the texture of old bone, and from somewhere ahead of them, from somewhere in the rock's own deep gut, came the faint, steady warmth that had been there all along. Corin said, very quietly, "We're going to live." It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite a statement either. It was something between the two. The kind of thing you say when you have held your certainty in reserve for hours because you couldn't afford to be wrong about it, and now you have enough evidence to let yourself believe. Brenna said nothing. She added a piece of dry wood to the fire and let it grow. Outside, above and behind them, the blizzard was eating the world. Snow was burying the path they'd walked, the hollow they'd left, the faces of the people who had watched them go. The mountain was indifferent to all of it, warm in its own hidden places, going about the ancient business of being stone. Inside the cave, the fire caught and held. They worked until they couldn't see, then slept, then worked again. The first 48 hours were practical in the way that emergencies tend to be practical. There was no time for anything but the immediate problem, and the immediate problems were fire, shelter, water, and an assessment of what they actually had to work with. Brenna had the list in her head before they'd been in the cave an hour, running the inventory of the packs the way a mill runs grain, methodical, without sentiment. 2 wool blankets, 5 days of dried meat, 3 days if they weren't careful, which they were going to be. 1 skinning knife, 1 small axe, a length of good rope, a tin cup, a fire starter kit, the geological map, and a small notebook that had been their mother's and that Brenna had added to the pack herself at the last moment, instinctively, before she'd fully understood they were being exiled. And the seeds were the thing. Harlan had said seeds from the fall stores, and he had not been careless about it. There were packets of squash, winter rye, turnip, and 1 small paper twist of something that turned out to be an early variety of cave moss that their mother had experimented with years ago, trying to see if it could be cultivated indoors. Brenna held that last packet for a long time. She didn't know if her uncle had included it deliberately or by accident. She decided it didn't matter. "Rye first," Corin said when Brenna showed her. "If the soil here responds at all to the geothermal warmth, rye has the best germination tolerance for—" "I know," Brenna said. "I wasn't second-guessing you. I was thinking out loud. They sound the same." "Only to you." Corin took the rye packet and turned it in her hands. "The depression at the north end, the one with the dead vegetation, that's where we try first." "Agreed, but the soil needs amendment. It's clay-heavy." The limestone particulate in the walls and the leaf matter from the ravine floor. Yes, alkaline balance. Corin looked at her. You've been planning this since we left. I've been planning this since I was 16 and read Voss's survey the 4th time. You didn't tell me. Brenna thought about this. I was afraid you talked me out of believing it was real. Corin was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant she was taking something in. Then, I wouldn't have. I know that now. There were things between them, below the surface of those words. The old question of why Brenna held things back, of whether it was caution or fear or some habit of protecting herself that she hadn't fully examined yet. They didn't get into it then. The cold was still in their bones and the fire needed tending and the day was already spending itself and there was too much to do. But the words had been said and they stayed in the air between them for the rest of the evening, not uncomfortable, just present. Constructing shelter inside the cave took 4 days. They had no lumber, not to start with. Brenna resolved that problem by spending the second morning in the ravine, using the axe on a stand of dead birch she found against the eastern wall. The birch had died in place and dried where it stood, which was either good luck or the kind of thing that happens in geothermally warmed ground where the natural processes don't quite work the way they should. She didn't waste time analyzing it. She cut what she could and dragged it inside, and Corin spent the same morning pulling stones from the ravine floor and stacking them along the natural shelf on the west wall, beginning the structure of a windbreak that would also serve as a heat sink. They were not carpenters. Brenna knew this and said so. We're not trying to be carpenters, Corin said, fitting a cross brace between 2 upright stakes with a length of rope she'd cut to thirds. We're trying to make a structure that doesn't fall on us while we sleep. Those are different goals. The wall on the left is 2 inches out of plumb. Then we'll lean everything to the right. Stop watching me and start on the roof. The roof was branches laid dense and overlapping, weighted with stones, propped at an angle to shed what little moisture managed to find its way through the cave entrance. It would not have impressed anyone who had studied construction. It kept the wind off their sleeping place and held in the warmth from the fire below it, which was what it needed to do. The first night they slept under it, Brenna lay on her back on a mat of compacted leaf matter and stared at the underside of the rough ceiling and felt something that took her a while to identify. She kept turning it over in her mind, checking it from different angles, making sure it was what she thought it was. It was satisfaction. She had not felt it in a long time. Not happiness. Happiness was a different animal, and she was not going to claim it in the second week of their exile, in a cave, with 5 days of dried meat between them and a winter that hadn't reached its worst yet. But satisfaction was not the same as happiness. Satisfaction was the feeling of having used yourself correctly, of having brought your full capacity to bear on a real problem and found that the capacity was sufficient. It was, she thought, perhaps the only feeling that could honestly coexist with terrible circumstances, because it did not require the circumstances to be good. It only required that you had done something real with them. She turned her head and looked at Corin, who was asleep already, breathing slow and even, one hand loosely fisted under her chin. She looked peaceful in a way that she never quite managed when she was awake, because awake she was always in motion, assessing, deciding, moving. Sleep was the only thing that paused her. Brenna looked back at the ceiling. The cave was warm. The fire was steady. The seeds were still in their packets, safe in the pack against the wall, waiting for soil that wasn't ready yet. She closed her eyes. Oh, the greenhouse, if you could call it that, and eventually people would call it that, though there was nothing ornamental about it in its earliest form, began as a plot of soil roughly 8 feet square in the northern depression of the cave. Brenna had been right about the clay content. The native earth was cold compacted and dense, useful for holding heat, but nearly impermeable to roots without amendment. They spent 3 days moving material, limestone grit chipped from the cave walls with the axe, organic matter from the ravine floor, the ash from their fire mixed with water to moderate the pH. Corin worked the soil with her hands mostly, working the amendments in layers, pressing and turning with the focused patience of someone who understood that hurrying this particular process would make it longer, not shorter. My hands are going to look like an old woman's hands by spring, she said, on the second day, not with complaint exactly, more with a kind of resigned acknowledgement. They already looked like a working woman's hands, Brenna said from behind the axe. That's not the same thing. In every useful way it is. Corin flicked a piece of limestone grit in her direction. Brenna ducked it without looking up. They planted the winter rye first, as agreed. 12 seeds to the square foot. Shallower than ideal because the soil wasn't yet deep enough for standard depth, close enough to the warmest section of wall to take advantage of the geothermal gradient. Then the turnip, further from the wall, in the cooler outer rows where the root vegetables would benefit from the temperature differential. The squash they held back. Squash needed more space and more established soil, and they would not have that until the rye had come up and its root system had begun the work of loosening the clay beneath. The cave moss they planted last, in a shallow trough scratched into the base of the warmest wall, with less soil than anything else and more water. Their mother had written in her notebook that cave moss didn't need much of either, that it was, above all else, persistent. She had underlined the word, which was unusual for her. Then they waited. Waiting was its own kind of work. Not passive. They were never passive. There was too much to do for passive. But the days had a different quality now, with the planting done. They improved the shelter, built a stone-lined channel to redirect a small seep of groundwater from the cave wall into a usable collection point, mapped the full interior extent of the cave system, and found it went back 112 feet with a secondary chamber that caught better light from a fissure overhead during midday hours. And they talked. More than they'd talked in years, perhaps. Years in Dunmore Hollow, where they'd learned to be careful about what they said, and to whom, and in what company, where conversation had become a kind of navigation around obstacles rather than the thing itself. Here there were no obstacles except the ones the cave presented, and those were physical and therefore honest, and so the talking loosened. Old things got said, memories got examined. Their mother came up more than once, not with grief exactly, though the grief was always there under it, but with the specific kind of attention you give to someone who mattered, and who you want to make sure you still understand correctly, to make sure the memory hasn't softened into something false. She would have loved this, Corin said one evening, watching the fire. She'd have been furious about the soil quality, Brenna said. Corin laughed, and it was real this time, full and unguarded. You're right. She'd have spent the first week writing complaints about the alkaline balance in that notebook of hers. And then she'd have fixed it. And then she'd have fixed it, Corin agreed. She was quiet for a moment. I think she was afraid of Harlan. The word afraid sat there. Not in the way you'd think, Corin continued. Not afraid for herself, afraid for us. Afraid of what he would decide to do with us if she was gone. A pause. I wonder if she knew. Brenna looked at the fire. The coals were old, banked down, doing the slow, patient work of maintained heat. She prepared us, she said. The notebooks, the survey, the cave moss seeds. She looked at Corin. I think she knew something. Neither of them said anything else for a long while. On the 18th day, the first green shoot came up through the cave soil. It was a rye seedling, pale and thin from the limited light, leaning sideways toward the faint brightness of the cave entrance, but living, genuinely living, in ground that by any reasonable calculation should not have supported it. Corin found it first, in the morning, and called Brenna over without saying what she'd found, just come here. And Brenna came and crouched down beside the plot and looked at the seedling for a long time without speaking. It was the size of her thumbnail. It was the most important thing she had ever seen. Adjust the reflector, she said, her voice not quite steady. They'd rigged a piece of polished tin from the pack liner against the cave wall to direct the light from the entrance toward the growing plot. Angle it another 10 degrees. It needs more. I know, Corin said. She was already moving. Outside, the blizzard that had been gathering for 3 days broke over the mountain in full. The wind hit the ravine walls and screamed over them and drove the snow into drifts that would reach the second branches of the spruce trees by morning. The cold locked down everything that could be locked. Inside the cave, one small rye seedling leaned toward its light. The sisters worked on. The rye seedling did not die. That was the first miracle, and Brenna refused to call it that. She called it a confirmation of the geothermal gradient hypothesis, which was accurate, but Corin told her that calling it accurate didn't make it any less extraordinary, and Brenna said that extraordinary and miraculous were not the same thing, and Corin said she was impossible, and Brenna said she was precise, and that was how most of their conversations went when things were going well. Things were going well, in the specific and limited way that things can go well when you are living in a cave in the middle of the worst winter in 30 years with dwindling supplies and no certainty about anything beyond the next 2 days. The rye was up. 3 more seedlings appeared in the 48 hours after the first, pale and purposeful and leaning toward the polished tin reflector with the single-minded determination of things that intend to exist. Corin adjusted the reflector twice a day, tracking the angle of what little light filtered through the cave entrance, trying to give each seedling its best chance. She did this without being asked, without making a project of it, just as a thing that needed doing that she had assigned herself. Brenna spent those same days working the secondary chamber. The secondary chamber, the one 112 feet back, the one with the fissure overhead, had possibilities she'd been turning over since they first mapped it. The fissure was narrow, maybe 8 inches at its widest, but it ran from the cave ceiling up through the limestone to somewhere above, and on clear days a column of actual daylight came down through it like a slow, cold pour of water. Not much light, but more than the entrance gave and from overhead, which meant it fell directly onto the chamber floor rather than at the sideways angle that made the main cave-growing area so difficult to manage. The problem was the floor. The secondary chamber's floor was rough limestone shelf broken by a wide crack running east to west, and the native soil in it was even more clay-dense than the northern depression had been. Brenna spent 2 full days with the axe and a sharpened stick she'd made from one of the birch offcuts, breaking up the worst of it, working in amendments, losing her temper twice and regaining it both times without saying anything she couldn't take back. On the evening of the second day, Corin brought her food, dried meat, a cup of the weak broth they'd started making by boiling bones a second time and then a third, and sat on the edge of the limestone shelf and watched her sister work without comment for a while. "Your hands are bleeding," she said finally. Brenna looked at them. The right palm had opened along an old callus line where she'd been gripping the stick too hard. She hadn't noticed. "It's fine. It's not fine. It's just not serious. Those are different things. You sound like me. I've had 20 years to absorb your habits." Corin held out a strip of cloth she'd torn from the hem of her underlayer. "Let me wrap it." Brenna sat down and let her. Corin's hands were quick and competent and not particularly gentle. She was not a gentle person by nature, not in the soft or comforting sense, but she was careful, which was better in most situations. She pulled the binding snug and tucked the end under without ceremony. "The secondary chamber is going to work," Brenna said. "I know. The light column is better than I expected. If the fissure runs true to the surface, we'll get midday sun directly into the bed for—" "Brenna," Corin looked at her. "I know. I agreed with you about the secondary chamber on the first day. I don't need convincing." Brenna was quiet for a moment. "I'm not trying to convince you. I'm thinking out loud." "I know that too." Corin handed her the cup of broth. "Drink this before it goes cold." It was already cold. Brenna drank it anyway. "Sushi? Anu? But." The day settled into a rhythm that had nothing to do with the rhythms either of them had lived before. Not the rhythms of Dunmore Hollow, with its mill schedules and market days and the slow social calendar of a small mountain community. Not the rhythms of their childhood, which had been shaped by their mother's particular habits of rising early and working late and pausing in the late afternoon to write in whatever notebook was current. This rhythm was entirely their own invention, built from necessity and then maintained by choice. They rose when the light changed at the cave entrance. Not dawn exactly, because they were deep enough in the ravine that true dawn didn't reach them, but the quality shift of early morning when the dark outside went from black to gray. They tended the fire first, always, because the fire was the anchor of everything else. Then water. The seep channel required daily maintenance, a small stone cleared here, the collection basin wiped free of mineral deposit there. Then the growing plots, both of them together, checking each seedling, measuring growth against the marks Brenna made on the cave wall in charcoal, adjusting the reflector, working the soil at the plot edges where it kept wanting to compact. Then whatever the day's construction project was. They were always in the middle of a construction project. The shelter had been first, then the growing plots, then the secondary chamber preparation, then a series of smaller things, a better system for storing the remaining seeds in the pack so they stayed dry, a hook system on the west wall for hanging the tools so they weren't always being stepped on in the dark, A second sleeping mat made from compacted dried moss that was objectively worse than the first, but gave them the ability to sleep on opposite sides of the fire, which sometimes they needed. Corin built a small shelf above the fire using flat stones and the last 3 feet of rope for drying strips of whatever they managed to supplement their diet with. The cave was in a limestone system, and limestone systems typically supported small cave fauna. The occasional blind beetle, the fungal growths along the deeper walls that Brenna identified as non-toxic. After a careful examination, she took more seriously than she let on. Neither of those things was going to sustain them. But the ravine outside had animal traffic. She could see tracks in the mornings, the pressed-in signatures of rabbits, and once what looked like the careful pad prints of a fox. And Corin had begun, methodically, to learn snares. She was not good at snares yet. She said so directly, without apology. "I've never done this, and I'm learning it from a description in Mama's notebook, and the description is not complete. I'm going to get it wrong several times before I get it right." "I know," Brenna said. "I'm telling you so you don't expect meat tomorrow." "I didn't expect meat tomorrow." "Good." Corin looked at the half-made snare loop in her hands. "I think the tension is wrong on this. The release mechanism needs to be faster. The notebook doesn't say how fast. The notebook says fast enough that the animal doesn't have time to react. That's not a measurement." Mama was an agricultural scientist. She wasn't writing a trapping manual. "She should have been more thorough." Brenna almost smiled. "She was thorough. She was just thorough about the things she cared about." Corin looked at the snare. "She cared about us surviving." "Yes, but she thought we'd survive in a house." The snare took 4 iterations and 8 days before it produced anything. On the morning of the 9th day, Corin came back from checking the ravine line with a rabbit, holding it by the back legs with an expression that was equal parts practical satisfaction and the particular discomfort of someone who is fully committed to a necessary thing and still finds the reality of it a little harder than the idea. "First one," she said. "Good," Brenna said. "I felt bad about it for approximately 30 seconds. That seems right. Then I felt hungry and the 30 seconds ended." She held it out. "You're better with the knife." "I'm marginally better with the knife." "Then use your marginal advantage. I'll keep the fire." Sometime in what Brenna calculated to be the 5th week, she had been keeping a charcoal count on the cave wall, 1 mark per day, and the marks were accumulating in a way that was starting to feel less like a tally and more like a testament. The rye in the main growing plot reached 2 inches. 2 inches was not a harvest. 2 inches was barely a proof of concept, but Brenna measured it on a morning when the temperature outside had dropped to the kind of cold that made sound itself seem to compress, when the ravine was sealed under 4 feet of packed snow, and the wind above them was doing something that sounded architectural in its force and permanence. She measured it, made a mark in the notebook, and sat back on her heels in the warm floor of the cave and let herself feel, very briefly, the full weight of what it meant. They were going to make it through winter. She had known it, had held the knowledge at a careful distance, not letting herself be certain about it because certainty about things you couldn't yet control was a form of recklessness that she couldn't afford. But the rye was 2 inches tall, and the turnip seedlings were beginning to show in the cooler outer rows, and the cave moss on the heated wall base had taken hold and was spreading in a slow, dark green creep that their mother's notebook said would, by spring, provide a continuous harvestable surface. They were not going to starve. The cave was not going to fail them. She wrote in the notebook. Not calculations this time. She did those separately in the margins, but words. Something she rarely did because writing feelings down always felt slightly theatrical to her, as if she were composing a letter to someone. But she wrote this. Week 5. Rye at 2 inches. Tea seedlings emerging in rows 3 and 4. Moss established along north wall. Air temperature in main chamber averaging 11 degrees Celsius. Outside, approximately minus 18 degrees Celsius, possibly colder. Corin's snare line, 6 rabbits this week, 2 this morning. We are not going to die here. I want to write that again. We are not going to die here. She didn't write it again. She closed the notebook and put it in the pack and went to help Corin clean the morning's catch. The squash went into the secondary chamber on what Brenna counted as day 41. They'd held it back deliberately. Squash was demanding, spatially and nutritionally, and the secondary chamber soil hadn't been ready until now. A full 6 weeks of amendment and slow cultivation, transforming it from limestone-heavy dead earth into something that gave slightly under her palm, that smelled like soil is supposed to smell. Corin had planted a test bed of rye in the secondary chamber's outer edge 3 weeks earlier, and the rye had come up thinner than in the main plot. The light was better, but the soil was still finding itself. But it had come up. That was the qualification Brenna had been waiting for. They planted the squash seeds in hills, 3 seeds per hill, 4 hills in a pattern that used the chamber's floor space without crowding the rye borders. Corin patted the last hill smooth and sat back on her heels and looked at the column of midday light coming down through the fissure overhead, which at this particular hour landed almost precisely in the center of the chamber floor. "That's everything," she said. "Everything we have," Brenna said. "Is that frightening or comforting?" Brenna thought about it. "Neither. It's just true." She looked at the 4 hills. "We planted everything we had the day we left too, in a way. We just didn't know the ground yet." Corin looked at her sideways. "That's almost poetic. Don't tell anyone." "Who would I tell?" Corin stood, brushing soil from her knees. "We're the only people on this mountain." She said it lightly, the way she said most things, but it settled into the air between them differently than it would have a month ago. A month ago, it would have felt like a statement of danger. Now it felt like a statement of fact, and the fact had texture to it. Not quite loneliness, not quite freedom, something that sat between the two and didn't resolve cleanly into either. They were the only people on this mountain, and the mountain had turned out to be enough. It was on day 47 that Corin first heard something in the ravine that wasn't wind or animal. She had gone out in the early afternoon to check the snare line and reset the 2 that had been sprung and left empty. A fox had been working her line in the nights, learning its pattern faster than she liked, and she'd been trying to vary the placement to stay ahead of it. She was at the far end of the ravine, crouching over the furthest snare, when she heard the sound. Footsteps. Human footsteps. The distinct compression and creak of a person's weight on packed snow coming from above the ravine rim. She did not move for 3 full seconds. Then she was on her feet and moving back toward the cave entrance, fast and low, and the footsteps above kept coming, moving along the ravine rim in a direction that suggested whoever was up there was following the rim rather than the trail below, which meant they hadn't found the entrance slot yet. She reached the cave and put her head inside. Someone's outside. Brenna looked up from the notebook. Person? Definitely person. Moving along the rim. Haven't found the slot. Brenna was on her feet. She picked up the skinning knife, not as a weapon exactly, but as an object that focused thinking. One person? Sounds like one. Adult? Heavy step. Either adult or a large child, and why would a large child be alone on this mountain? Fair. Brenna looked at the knife, made a decision, and set it back down. Let's go see. Corin looked at her. You want to go meet them? I want to see them before they find the entrance on their own. At least if we go out, we're choosing the moment. She was already pulling on her coat. Coming? Corin pulled on hers. They came out of the slot together, which was exactly the kind of thing that had always unsettled people in Dunmore Hollow. The 2 of them appearing simultaneously from the same direction, moving at the same pace, with the same expression, which at the moment was cautious and direct and entirely not welcoming. The figure on the ravine rim above them stopped. He was young, younger than they'd expected from the heavy footfall, maybe 22 or 23, and thin in the way that people who spend weeks in deep snow get thin, which is a specific kind of thin that starts at the face and works inward. He was wearing good winter gear, better than most in Dunmore Hollow could have afforded, which meant trapper. He had a pack on his back and a rifle slung over his shoulder and both hands visible, which Brenna noticed and credited. He looked at them for a moment. You're alive, he said. He said it the way you say something that you'd already decided you believed but weren't fully certain of until this exact second. Clearly, Corin said. They said... He stopped. Started again. Most people figured you were dead after the first week of that storm. Most people were wrong, Brenna said. Who are you? He seemed to need a moment to organize himself. He was staring at them in a way that wasn't rude exactly, but wasn't polished either. Raw surprise, the kind that happens when reality lands differently from the expectation you've been carrying. Elias Reed, I trapped the upper northwest line. Have for 3 seasons. A pause. I'm not from Dunmore Hollow. He stopped again. You just what? Corin said. I heard what they did. His jaw shifted slightly. The whole story came out in pieces. Harlan Vale's version first, then some other versions. I was angry about it, is the truth. I kept thinking about it while I was running my line. He looked at the ravine, then at the cave slot behind them, then at them. I didn't really expect to find you. I just didn't want to go back to my cabin without looking. The 3 of them stood in the cold, in the narrow ravine, with the wind doing its work overhead and the snow pressing down on everything outside. Brenna looked at him. She had a habit of looking at people for a long time before she said anything, which people tended to find uncomfortable, and which she'd learned to modulate in town because it made neighbors nervous. She didn't modulate it now. He held her look without flinching, which was something. Elias Reed, she said, how is the town? His expression shifted. Something behind it went harder and quieter. Bad, he said. It's bad. She looked at Corin. Corin looked back at her. Come in out of the cold, Brenna said. We'll make broth. He blinked. There's a cave. Come in. He came down the ravine wall carefully, testing his footholds, and they led him through the entrance slot and into the warmth. He stopped inside the entrance and stood very still for a moment, and Brenna watched him take in the fire, the shelter structure, the growing plots, the 2 inches of rye visible even from the entrance, the stone-lined water channel, the tool wall, all of it. And she watched his face do something that she recognized because she'd felt it herself on day 18, standing over the first rye seedling. He said nothing for a long time. You built all this, he said finally. We had time, Corin said, and put water on for broth. He sat across the fire from them and drank the weak broth. It was rabbit now, not bone water, and Corin had started adding the young rye shoots to it, which improved it considerably, and told them what he knew about Dunmore Hollow. The grain stores were lower than the council had admitted publicly. 2 of the older families had lost elders to the cold in the first month, and one of the Colburn children, the youngest, the one barely past 2, had been sick since before midwinter with something nobody had been able to name. The hunting had been poor. The trappers who worked the lower lines had brought in less than half of what a normal season should have yielded. He said Harlan Vale had not spoken publicly about his nieces since they left, not to defend himself and not to explain. He just didn't speak of them, which the town seemed content to treat as an end to the matter. Brenna listened to all of it without commenting. Her face did its careful, reading thing. Corin watched the fire. When he finished, the cave was quiet except for the small sounds of burning wood and the distant, diminished sound of wind. How often do you run this line? Brenna asked. Every 10, 12 days, depends on the weather. And you pass close to this ravine? I can. It's a half-mile off my main route. She looked at the growing plots. She looked at Corin, who was already looking at her. They had been having this particular conversation without words for 20 years. And they concluded it in approximately 4 seconds. When you come through next time, Brenna said, bring empty sacks if you have them. We'll have rye to send back with you. Elias Reed looked at her. He looked at the 2-inch rye seedlings, the pale, determined, alive rye seedlings growing in cave soil in the middle of the worst winter in living memory, and something moved across his face that was not quite disbelief and not quite wonder, and was perhaps some combination of the two that doesn't have a clean name in English. You're going to feed the town, he said. We're going to try, Brenna said. Come back in 10 days. Bring the sacks. He looked at the rye one more time. Then he looked at her. I'll be here in 8, he said. Elias came back in 8 days, as he'd promised, with 4 empty grain sacks folded flat inside his pack, and a small parcel of salt wrapped in oilskin that he set on the stone shelf beside the fire without comment. The way you leave something for people without wanting to make a production of it. The rye wasn't ready yet. He'd known it wouldn't be. He'd done the arithmetic somewhere on the trail back to his cabin and understood that 2-inch seedlings needed more than 8 days to become harvestable grain. But he came anyway, which Brenna noted without saying anything about it, and he spent 2 hours helping Corin shore up the secondary chamber's eastern wall where the limestone had been shedding small chips onto the outer rye bed. He was useful with his hands in the uncomplicated way of someone who has spent years making do in remote places. without waiting to be asked and without overstating what he'd done afterward. Corin watched him work with the expression she used when she was revising an initial assessment. When he left, she said, "He's all right." "He is," Brenna said. "I didn't expect him to come back." "I did." Brenna was making marks in the notebook, recording the rye height, 3.5 inches now in the main plot, 2.25 in the secondary chamber. He said 8 days and he meant it. People who mean what they say usually come back. That's a very small category of people. It is, Brenna agreed, which is why it's worth noticing. He came back 4 more times over the following 3 weeks, and each time the cave was further along than the last, and each time he stayed longer, not because anyone invited him to linger, but because there was always something that needed a third pair of hands, and he had them. The rye in the main plot reached harvest height on his 4th visit. Not a full harvest, not the thick-stalked density of an open field, but enough for the purpose they had in mind, and Corin cut it with the skinning knife while Brenna held the stems, and Elias watched from the entrance of the chamber with his hands in his pockets, and the particular stillness of someone witnessing something they don't have the right words for. "How much?" he said. Brenna weighed the cut stalks in her hands. "Enough for a small loaf. Maybe a loaf and a quarter if the grain fills out the way I think it will." She looked up at him. "Who in town is worst off?" He didn't hesitate. "The Colburn family, 4 children, youngest still sick, and old Marta Weiss. She's been on the Priestley Brothers charity since her husband died in October, and they're running low themselves." "Start there," Brenna said. "Don't tell anyone where it came from." He looked at her. "They'll figure it out eventually." "Eventually is fine. Right now I just want the food to get there without anyone deciding they have feelings about the source before the child has eaten." Elias was quiet for a moment. That's probably right." He took the grain carefully, as if he understood what it had cost to grow it. "I'll go direct. Tonight if the weather holds." "It'll hold until morning," Corin said from the corner, not looking up from the second cutting she was bundling. "The pressure's been steady for 3 days. You have a window." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "The seep channel flow rate changes with barometric pressure. It's been consistent since Tuesday." She glanced up. "Also the way sound travels in the ravine, low pressure makes it duller, high pressure sharpens it." She went back to her bundling. "You get used to reading the things you have available." Elias looked at Brenna. Brenna looked back at him with an expression that said, "Yes, she's always like this, and also I know, and also don't make a thing of it." He nodded once and picked up the pack. The second harvest came 3 weeks after the first, larger because they'd replanted the cut area immediately, and the geothermal gradient in the main plot had proven more consistent than the secondary chamber. The soil there had settled into itself, found its rhythm, and the rye came back faster. The turnips in the outer rows were ready too, fat and firm and improbably healthy looking for things that had been grown underground, and Corin pulled them with an expression of genuine surprise, as if even she hadn't quite believed they'd work. "They're good," she said, brushing soil off one and biting into it. She chewed. "They're actually good." "You didn't think they'd be good?" "I thought they'd be edible. Good is better than edible." She handed the turnip to Brenna, who bit into the other side. It was dense and slightly sweet, and tasted like something real in a way that the dried meat and bone broth had long since stopped tasting. Brenna ate her half without comment, which was its own kind of comment. By the time Elias came for the second transfer, they had 4 bundles of rye and 14 turnips, and a portion of the cave moss that Brenna had determined was nutritionally substantial enough to matter. High in minerals, edible raw or dried, and growing fast enough on the north wall that harvesting it didn't threaten the colony. She'd written out on a scrap of the oilskin wrapper how to prepare the moss and what it was good for, in her tight, economical handwriting. Elias read the note. "People are going to think this is strange." "People who are hungry enough stop caring about strange," Brenna said. "Fair point." He folded the note and put it in his coat pocket. He was quiet for a moment, loading the sacks with the careful deliberateness he brought to everything. "The Colburn girl is better, the youngest one. She started eating 2 days after I brought the first loaf." Neither sister said anything. I thought you'd want to know," he said. Corin, who was standing with her back to both of them checking the replanted rye bed, went still for just a second. Then she kept moving. Brenna said, We wanted to know. Thank you. It was a small exchange. It was not a small thing. What? The pattern established itself over the next 4 weeks and held with the reliability of anything built on genuine mutual need. Elias ran his trapline, came through the ravine every 8 to 10 days, collected what was ready, carried it to the families in the worst condition in Dunmore Hollow. He never announced where it came from. He said he'd found a winter cache. Then he said he knew a trapper who'd had a good season and wanted to share. Then, as the quantities grew and the explanations became harder to maintain, he just stopped explaining and let people draw their own conclusions. The conclusions were slow in coming. People in hard circumstances tend to focus on the immediate fact of food rather than its provenance, and for several weeks the town seems to have accepted the deliveries with the simple animal gratitude of the hungry without asking too many questions. It was, Elias told the sisters, as if they had collectively decided not to look too hard at a gift horse. But the quantities were getting harder to explain away. The secondary chamber had come into full production by what Brenna counted as day 89, and the squash that she had held back until the soil was right and planted with the specific patience of someone who understood that squash either worked or it didn't, and there was no middle ground, had done something she had hoped for but not promised herself. It had flourished. The combination of direct overhead light from the fissure and the well-amended soil and the steady warmth had produced vines that ran the length of the secondary chamber, and produced, in the way of squash that has found its ideal conditions, enthusiastically and without restraint. By the end of the 10th week, there were 11 squash of harvestable size sitting on the secondary chamber floor. And Corin had looked at them for a long moment and then looked at Brenna with an expression that was, for Corin, about as close to joy as her face generally permitted. 11, she said. Plus whatever comes in the next 2 weeks before the growth slows, Brenna said. We can't eat 11 squash. No, we cannot. Elias is going to need a bigger pack. He's going to need help. That was a new variable. They'd been operating on the assumption that Elias as a single carrier was sufficient, and for grain and turnips he had been. 11 squash, plus the ongoing rye and turnip production, plus the moss. The volume was outgrowing what one person could move discreetly on foot across half a mile of detour from a trap line. Something was going to have to change about the arrangement, and they both understood that the change would mean more exposure, more people knowing where the food came from, and all the complications that would bring. They were discussing this, practically and without much emotion, on the evening of day 92 when Elias arrived a day ahead of schedule. He came through the entrance slot with more speed than usual, and his face had the tight, over-controlled look of a man delivering bad news who has been rehearsing how to say it on the walk over. Brenna saw it immediately and put down the notebook. What happened? He pulled off his hat. There's sickness in town. Real sickness. Not just the cold and the hunger. Something moving through the families. Started with the Priestley household 3 days ago. By yesterday, 4 more families had it. Fever, mostly. Some worse than that. Corin turned around from the wall where she'd been checking the moss. Children? Adults too. But yes, children. He sat down heavily on the stone shelf. Harlan Vale's been going door to door with what medicine the town has left, which isn't much. He looks bad, honestly. Not sick, I don't think, just worn through. The name sat in the cave air differently than other words. Brenna watched Corin's back go very slightly straighter. She watched her own hands flatten on her knees and felt something move through her chest that was neither here nor there, not the anger she'd expected to feel when Harlan Vale came up in conversation. Not forgiveness either, just something that didn't have a clean label and that she chose, for now, to leave unlabeled. What does the town have? She asked. Medically. Yarrow, some of it. They used most of the willow bark in January. There's feverfew somewhere, but nobody can remember who has it. The healer, Mrs. Thorne, she's one of the sick ones, which is... He stopped. It's not good. Brenna looked at the cave wall. She was running through the notebook in her head, their mother's careful notes, the pages on plant medicine that she'd read and filed away in the same automatic way she'd filed away Voss's geological survey. Not because she'd needed it then, but because it existed and she had a habit of keeping what existed. The cave moss, she said. Corin turned fully around. Antipyretic properties. Yes, I was thinking the same thing. It won't replace willow bark, but it'll support it. And we have Brenna was already at the pack, pulling out the notebook, finding the page. Dried yarrow in the seed stores. Mama packed it with the medicinal seeds. I found it in week 2 and set it aside. She looked up. I didn't say anything because we didn't need it then. You kept it, Elias said. I keep things that might matter. She was already making a list in the margin of the notebook page. How quickly can you get back to town? 3 hours if the snow's packed. 4 if it's not. It's packed, Corin said. Pressure's still high. Brenna looked at the list. Then she looked at Elias, and then at Corin, and then she made a decision that she'd been circling for weeks without fully admitting she was circling it. You're going to have to tell them, she said, where this is coming from. All of it. Elias was quiet. If we're sending medicine, they need to know the source. They need to know it's reliable, and they need to know who made the preparation so they know the dosage isn't guesswork. She held his look. It was going to come out anyway. The squash alone? I know, he said. I know, I was just... He rubbed the back of his neck. I wanted to wait until I thought people were ready. People are sick, Corin said simply. Ready is not the current concern. He looked at them both. He had the expression of a man trying to predict a reaction he couldn't fully calculate. There are people in that town who are going to have trouble with this. I know, Brenna said. Harlan Vale is one of them, and also the one most likely to be in charge of distributing what you send. I know that too. Silence. The fire made its small sounds. Do it anyway, Brenna said. Tell them the truth. All of it. Elias looked at her for a moment. That direct, assessing look she'd noticed on the first day. The one that didn't flinch. Then he nodded once, stood up, and held out his hands for the prepared bundles. The reaction in Dunmore Hollow to the truth did not arrive all at once. Elias brought them back the account in pieces over the following 2 visits, and Brenna assembled those pieces into a picture the way she assembled most things, methodically, without letting the emotional weight of individual details distort the overall shape. The medicine had gone to the sick families first, which was all that mattered in the immediate term. Mrs. Thorne, recovering slowly from her own fever, had looked at the prepared cave moss compound and the dried yarrow and the dosage notes and told Elias, according to his account, that whoever wrote these notes knew what they were doing and she wanted to know who. When he told her, she hadn't said much, just looked at the notes again and said well in a tone that apparently covered a great deal of ground. The families who'd been receiving food, the Colburns, Marta Weiss, the 3 others in worse condition, had already suspected. The Colburn mother had apparently said, when Elias confirmed it, that she'd known for weeks and had been grateful and didn't see why anything needed to change. Marta Weiss had cried, which Elias relayed with some discomfort because he was not sure what kind of crying it was and felt it wasn't his place to interpret it. The harder reactions came from other quarters. The Priestley brothers, whose vocal opposition to the sisters had been among the loudest on that January morning, had gone very quiet when the news reached them. The specific quiet, Elias said, of men who cannot figure out how to be angry about something that is keeping their children alive. Elder Prent, who had been one of the council members who voted on the exile, had reportedly gone to his house and not come out for a day and a half. And Harlan Vale had stood in the middle of the main street of Dunmore Hollow and listened to Elias tell the full story, and had not said a single word the entire time, and then had walked home, and the people who watched him do it said afterward that he walked like a man carrying something too heavy to put down and too heavy to keep holding. Brenna wrote none of this in the notebook. She kept it in her head, where it lived alongside everything else she kept there. The geological survey, the soil amendment ratios, the rye germination counts, the face her uncle had made on a January morning when he'd looked at the air beside her ear instead of her eyes. She let it sit. She did not sort it yet. Corin said, on the evening after Elias's account, "Are you all right?" "I'm thinking." "I know. That's why I'm asking." Brenna looked at the fire. "I keep trying to feel something clean about it. Just one clean feeling. But there's too much in the way." "Like what?" "Like..." She stopped. Tried again. "Like the fact that I'm glad the Colburn child is better. I'm genuinely glad. And I can hold that at the same time as being angry about January, and neither feeling cancels the other out, and I don't know what to do with that." Corin was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do anything with it. You can just let them both be true." "That sounds like something Mama would say." "She said a version of it once. After that business with the mill council, when they took Papa's assessment and used it and then didn't credit him. She said you can be right and angry and generous all at the same time, and none of those things is a contradiction. Brenna remembered it vaguely. She'd been 12, maybe 13, and had not fully understood it then. She understood it better now. She was right, she said. She usually was, Corin said, about the things that mattered. It was on day 107 that Harlan Vale appeared at the top of the ravine. Brenna was in the secondary chamber adjusting the light reflector when Corin's voice came from the main cave, level and careful. "Brenna, come here." She came. Corin was standing at the cave entrance, just inside the slot, looking up. Brenna looked up. He was at the rim. He was alone. He was not moving with the careful route-finding gait of a trapper or a man who knew this terrain. He was moving the way exhausted people move when they have committed to a direction and are running on commitment rather than energy. Each step a small decision, totaling into a long one. He looked worse than she'd expected. Not from the cold, he was dressed adequately, but from the inside. His face had gone the gray-yellow of a man who had not been sleeping, and he'd lost weight in the way that happened to big men who stopped eating properly, which made him look somehow both larger and diminished at the same time. He saw them. He stopped. Neither sister moved. The three of them held that position for a moment that felt longer than it was, the two women at the cave entrance looking up, the man at the ravine rim looking down, all of them in the gray midwinter light with the mountain doing its indifferent business all around them. He started down the wall. He was not graceful about it. He slipped twice on the descent and caught himself both times with his hands. And by the time he reached the ravine floor, his palms were scraped and he was breathing harder than the exertion should have made him. He walked toward them. He stopped about 6 feet away. He looked at the ravine, the slot entrance, the compressed snow floor that bore the marks of their foot traffic, the faint warmth that was perceptible even out here if you stood still and paid attention. He looked at them. He said, "There are 3 families with children in fever. Mrs. Thorne is better, but she's not strong enough to tend them all. We've used everything she had." "We know," Brenna said. "Elias told us." He looked at her face, fully, which he hadn't done in January. She let him. "I'm not—" He stopped. Started again, more carefully, like a man choosing words from a limited supply. "I didn't come to explain myself. I know what I did. I'm not going to stand here and—" He stopped again. His jaw worked. "I'm asking for the families, not for me." The cave was warm behind them. The rye was growing. The squash sat heavy and useful on the secondary chamber floor. Brenna felt all of it at her back while she looked at this man who had packed 2 bags the night before he sent them out into the worst blizzard in 30 years. And she felt the things she'd been letting sit unsorted since Elias first said his name, and she felt it clarify. Not into forgiveness, exactly. Not yet, and maybe not ever in any clean sense, but into something that was beside the point of forgiveness, something more practical and perhaps more honest than that. "Come inside," she said. "We'll put together what we have." He blinked. He had not expected it to be that simple, she could tell. He'd come prepared for something harder. She thought about telling him that making it hard would not help the sick children, but she didn't say it because it would have been unkind in a way that she didn't want to be, not today. "Come in," she said again, more gently, and stood aside to let him through the slot. He came in. He walked into the cave slowly, and the warmth took him the way warmth takes cold people. Gradually, perceptibly, his shoulders coming down from where they'd been locked up near his ears. He looked at everything. He looked for a long time at the growing plots, the rye and the turnips, and the moss colony spreading green and purposeful along the north wall. He looked at the shelter structure with its imperfect roof and its stone windbreak, and the 2 sleeping mats and the tool wall, and the tin cup hanging on its hook. He looked at all of it, and Brenna watched him look, and she thought, he is understanding what it cost. He is finally, actually understanding it. He didn't say anything about what he was seeing. She didn't ask him to. "Tell me about the families," she said, and pulled out the notebook and went to work. Harlan Vale sat across the fire from his nieces and told them about the sick families the way a man gives a military report. Names, symptoms, duration, what had been tried and hadn't worked, because that was the only mode left to him after whatever else he'd burned through getting here. Brenna wrote while he talked. Corin listened without moving. There were 3 children running high fevers. The oldest was 9, a boy named Clem Farrow, whose father had been one of the council members who voted in January, a fact that sat in the cave without anyone acknowledging it. The youngest was 4, a girl from the Wise household, Marta's granddaughter, visiting when the weather closed in and now stranded with the illness. The third was 12, old enough to be frightened, young enough that being frightened made everything worse. 2 adults were down as well, both older, both already weakened by the long winter. Brenna looked at her notes. She looked at the moss wall, the yarrow stores, the current rye harvest in the bundle by the shelter. She did the arithmetic without paper, the way she usually did arithmetic, running the numbers through some internal process that Corin had given up trying to follow or replicate. The moss compound will cover 3 days of fever reduction for all 5 patients if we prepare it at full concentration, she said. After that, we're down to what's still growing, which won't be enough unless the fever breaks before day 4. It usually breaks before day 4, Corin said. If it doesn't break by day 4, it's something worse than what we're thinking. If it's something worse than what we're thinking, the moss compound won't be the variable that matters anyway. Harlan was watching this exchange with the expression of a man watching 2 people speak a language he almost understands. "What do you need me to do?" Brenna looked at him. It was the right question, the first fully right thing he'd said since he came through the entrance, and she gave it the credit it deserved. "Can you carry 4 sacks, full weight, up and out of this ravine?" "Yes." "And get them distributed to the right houses inside 2 hours of leaving here?" "Elias can help. He's been running the distribution." "Good. We'll pack medicine separately from food. The dosage notes go with the medicine. Mrs. Thorne needs to read them, not interpret them, not adapt them. Read them exactly." "I'll tell her." "Tell her twice." A pause. "I'll tell her twice," he said. Corin was already at the supply stores, working quickly and without waste. The moss compound first, measured into portions on a flat stone, and then wrapped in sections of the oilskin, each portion labeled in charcoal on the wrapping. She worked with the efficiency of someone who had been doing precise things with limited materials for 107 days and had gotten very good at it. Brenna packed the food alongside, the current rye harvest and 6 of the remaining squash, and the last of the turnips from the outer rows, which had come in that morning. Harlan sat and watched them work. He didn't offer to help, which was perhaps the most honest thing he did in that hour. He seemed to understand that the workflow between the sisters was calibrated to a precision that a third unfamiliar hand would only interrupt, and he stayed out of it. He looked at the cave. He looked at the shelter structure and the tool wall and the sleeping mats. He looked at the growing plots for a long time, in the particular way of someone who keeps returning to a thing they can't fully account for. Once he started to say something and stopped. "Brenna," without looking up from the packing, "you can say it." A long pause. "I packed those bags the night before," he said. "The ones I brought to the door." "I know. I figured that out on the way up the first ridge. I wanted you to know that I knew. I understood what I was doing. I'm not going to pretend I didn't understand." Brenna set down the squash she was wrapping. She looked at him, fully, in the way she'd looked at him in January when he wouldn't look back. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because—" He stopped. His hands, resting on his knees, curled slightly. "Because saying I'm sorry is... it's not enough. I know it's not enough. And I didn't want to say it and have you think I thought it was enough." The cave was quiet, except for Corin's hands moving through the supply stores. Brenna held his look for a long moment. She thought about the first ridge in the blizzard, and the second ridge worse than the first, and Corin's voice saying we're going to live in the way that was half statement and half something that needed to be said aloud to be real. She thought about 18 days waiting for a rye seedling and what that waiting had felt like in the bones. She thought about her mother's notebook, which was in the pack 3 feet away, which she had read so many times she could recite it. She thought, he is right that it's not enough. He's also right that saying so is more honest than pretending it is. "I know it's not enough," she said. I'm not waiting for enough." She picked the squash back up and kept wrapping. "Help me carry these to the entrance." He stood up and came to help, and for the next 20 minutes they worked in the same space without speaking. And it was not comfortable and not resolved, and it was not pretending to be either of those things, which was, Brenna thought, the most they could honestly manage right now, and honestly was what she had. Harlan left with Elias. Elias had arrived at the rim while they were packing, apparently having tracked Harlan's trail from the hollow, and correctly predicted the destination. And the two men went out of the ravine loaded with everything the sisters could prepare, moving with the particular urgent economy of people who understand that what they're carrying matters to specific, named individuals, and that speed, therefore, has weight. Corin watched them go from the entrance slot. "He's not going to be all right for a long time," she said. "No," Brenna agreed. "Are you?" Brenna thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet. Ask me in the spring." She paused. "I meant what I said to him. I'm not waiting for enough. I don't want to spend the energy on it." "That's not the same as being all right." "No, it's not the same." She looked at the ravine, the old snow on the walls, the narrow strip of sky visible above. "But it's workable. I can work with that." Corin seemed to accept this. She went back inside. The next 12 days were the hardest of the entire winter, and not because of anything that happened in the cave. The cave, in fact, was running better than it ever had. The secondary chamber squash was still producing. The replanted rye in the main plot was on a faster germination cycle now that the soil was fully established, and the moss wall had spread to cover almost the entire north face, giving them a harvestable surface that required very little management compared to what it returned. Brenna had begun preparing a second medicinal compound using the moss and the last reserves of yarrow, anticipating that the illness in town might deepen before it broke. She worked with the quiet focus that had carried her through the previous 100 days, but there was a tension underneath it now that hadn't been there before, a waiting quality, like the pressure that builds in the air before weather. The tension was about the town, about the sick children and whether the medicine had been enough and whether Harlan had read the notes twice to Mrs. Thorne the way she'd told him to, and about Elias who hadn't come back yet and might be keeping away because things were worse and he didn't want to bring that here. On the 5th day of the waiting, Corin said, "You're not sleeping." "I'm sleeping." "You're lying still with your eyes closed, which is a different thing." Brenna was quiet. Then, "The 9-year-old, Clem Farrow. I keep thinking about him. His father voted in January." "I know, that's part of it." She turned onto her back and looked at the cave ceiling. "I don't want him to die because his father is a coward. That seems like the wrong consequence. Children don't die because of their father's cowardice. They die because of the illness. I know that intellectually. But I keep doing the arithmetic on whether we sent enough and coming up short." Corin was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that was, for Corin, unusually direct about her own internal state. "I've been doing the same arithmetic. I get a different answer every time depending on what I assume about the starting fever temperature. Which we don't know. Which we don't know." A pause. "We did what we could with what we had." "That's true. It doesn't help much." "No," Brenna said. "Doesn't help much." They lay in the dark and listened to the fire and let the arithmetic run without trying to stop it, because sometimes the only way through a thing is straight through. Elias came on the 7th day. He came quickly, which Brenna had learned to distinguish from his normal pace, and his face when he came through the slot was not carrying bad news. It was carrying something more complicated than that, something that required a moment to read properly. "The children?" she said immediately. "Fever broke in all 3. Day 4 on Clem Farrow, day 3 on the other 2. He sat down. He looked tired in the deep-down way that comes from a stretch of days that demanded more than they should have. Mrs. Thorne said the compound was... She said she hadn't seen anything work that well with what was available. She wanted to know where you learned it. "Our mother's notes," Brenna said. 14 years of her own experimentation. "I told her something like that. She wants to talk to you." Brenna absorbed this. "When things are more stable." She said, "Whenever you're ready." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth and set it on the stone shelf beside the fire. He did it carefully, deliberately, with the manner of someone who has been entrusted with something fragile and takes the trust seriously. "Harlan asked me to bring this." Neither sister moved for a moment. Then Corin walked over and picked it up and unwrapped it, and Brenna watched her sister's face do something she had not seen it do in a very long time. A sudden softness, quick as a breath, there and then controlled. Corin held it out. It was a sketchbook, small and cloth-bound and soft at the corners from years of handling, its cover stained at the lower right with something that might have been clay or might have been soil. Brenna knew it before she touched it. She had last seen it on the shelf beside her mother's bed 7 years ago, the morning of the funeral, when Harlan had been moving through the house with the purposeful numbness of a man who was dealing with objects because he could not deal with what the objects meant. She had thought it was gone. She took it from Corin and held it, and did not open it immediately. The cover was exactly as she remembered. The cloth had faded at the spine, but the feel of it in her hands was so specific, so densely associated with her mother sitting by the window in the late afternoon light, drawing in the focused and contented silence of someone who had found the thing they did best, that holding it was like being handed a very concentrated piece of a time that was gone. She opened it. Her mother had sketched everything: plants in early growth, root systems exposed and carefully labeled, the mountain visible from the window of the house in 3 different seasons, each version slightly different in line, as if she'd been studying how it changed. A drawing of Brenna at maybe 8 years old, caught in profile reading something, her hair loose and her feet bare on the kitchen floor, rendered with the affectionate precision of someone who finds the ordinary deeply interesting. Several pages of what appeared to be soil cross-sections, annotated in her tight handwriting. A drawing of Corin asleep, very young, one hand open on the pillow. On the last used page, there was a sketch of the mountain's upper range, the northwest quadrant, the ravines, the limestone formations. Beside it, in pencil, 2 words: "They'll find it." Brenna stared at those words for a long time. She thought about the seeds, specifically the cave moss seeds in their paper twist. She thought about Voss's survey folded into the notebook. She thought about her mother at 7 years old dying and somehow, in some form, still ahead of them. She closed the sketchbook. Corin was watching her. "She knew," Brenna said. Her voice was steady, but only because she was using the steadiness she kept in reserve for things that would otherwise be too much. "She knew we'd need it, all of it." "Yes," Corin said softly. "She prepared us for something she hoped would never happen." "Yes." Brenna set the sketchbook in the pack, carefully, next to the notebook. She pressed her hand flat on the pack for a moment. Then she straightened up and looked at Elias, who had been sitting very still with the tact of someone who understands when they are in the presence of something private. "Did Harlan say anything when he gave you this?" "No," Elias said. "He just handed it to me and said to make sure it got here." Brenna nodded. She turned to the fire and added a piece of wood and watched it catch. And the doing of that ordinary thing, the small, reliable physics of wood and fire, brought her back to the present moment in the way she needed. "What's the state of the town now?" she said. "Past the illness?" Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Honest answer? Always. Surviving. Better than 2 weeks ago because the food you've been sending has made a real difference to the worst-off families. But there's still hunger, and there's still cold, and there's still—" He paused, choosing his word. "There's still a lot of people who have been inside their own heads for weeks, which makes them difficult," Corin supplied. "I was going to say brittle, but yes." He looked at Brenna. "There's talk about bringing the town's remaining seed stores up here, to the cave, for spring planting." He said it carefully, watching her face. "It's not an official proposal. It's more like people talking around the edges of the thing they actually mean to say, which is that you know something they don't, and they want to know it too." The fire crackled. A piece of wood shifted. "Who's talking?" Brenna asked. "Mrs. Thorne, a couple of the younger families. The Colburns." A beat. "Not the council yet, but the council hasn't been setting the terms of much lately." Brenna looked at Corin. Corin looked back. The conversation without words lasted about 6 seconds. "They'd have to do the work themselves," Brenna said. "We can teach the method, but we can't run a second cave operation from here. They'd need to identify their own site, prepare their own soil. It takes weeks of preparation before you plant anything." "I know. I think they know." "And they'd need to accept that what we tell them to do is based on actual assessment of the conditions, not— It can't be filtered through Elder Prent deciding what sounds reasonable to him." "Elder Prent," Elias said carefully, "has been quieter than usual." "Good. He can stay quiet." She was thinking now That particular quality of attention that meant the practical part of her had taken over from the emotional part, and they were into workable territory. The upper meadow south of the hollow. There's a limestone shelf there with a partial overhang. We noticed it on the survey. If the soil underneath is what I think it is, it could support a cold frame operation above ground by late March. Smaller scale than this, but faster to establish because they'd have direct light. Corin said, "You'd need to do a soil assessment first." "Yes." "Which means someone from the cave goes to the hollow." A pause. "Or someone from the hollow comes here." Both statements landed with their full weight. Someone from the cave goes to the hollow. Brenna Vale, who had been exiled from Dunmore Hollow on a January morning, walking back in through the front end of winter to assess soil conditions for the people who'd watched her go. Or the alternative, Dunmore Hollow coming here, to the cave they'd built, to learn. Elias said nothing. He was letting them work. Corin said at last, "I think they should come here." Brenna looked at her. "Let them see it," Corin said. "Not just receive the food and the medicine and the instructions on paper. Let them come and see what was built, and how, and what it took." Her voice was not hard, but it was clear. Not as a lesson in humility, just as the real thing, the actual work. People understand what they can see. Brenna thought about this. She thought about Harlan walking into the cave and looking at the shelter structure and the growing plots with that expression of a man who was finally, actually understanding what he'd asked them to walk into. She thought about Elias on his first visit, standing at the cave entrance with his hands in his pockets, his face doing something that was between disbelief and wonder. "You're right," she said. "I know. Don't be smug about it." "I'm not being smug. I'm being right, which is a different thing." Brenna almost smiled. She looked at Elias. "Tell whoever is talking about the seed stores to send 2 people up here in 5 days, people who can work and who will actually listen. Not the council, not Elder Prent, working people." "The Colburn father knows soil," Elias said. "He farmed lowland before he came up here." "Good. Him and one other." She paused. "And tell them they're coming to learn, not to be helped. Those are different things, and I want them clear on which one this is before they arrive." Elias nodded. He stood and did the thing he'd started doing recently without either sister asking or commenting on it, took a quick inventory of what was in the supply area, noted what was low, made a mental list, would bring what he could on the next run. He'd started doing this around the 3rd visit and had never stopped, and neither sister had said anything about it because there was nothing to say except thank you, and the work itself had become the thank you. He pulled on his hat. At the entrance, he paused. "Harlan asked me something," he said, not turning around. Whether you'd ever come back down to the hollow." The cave was very quiet. "What did you tell him?" Brenna said. "I told him I thought that was yours to decide." He paused. "He said yes." "That's what he said, just yes." He went out through the slot, and his footsteps faded up the ravine wall, and then were gone. Brenna sat by the fire for a long time after. The sketchbook was in the pack. The rye was growing in its bed. The mountain was doing its slow, permanent work around and above them, indifferent as ever, warm in its hidden places. She thought about her mother's pencil. They'll find it. Past tense in its certainty, written before the finding. She thought about what it meant to be prepared for by someone who loved you. The particular painful grace of it. The way it meant the love had been practical enough to look ahead and pack for a future it hoped you'd never need. She thought about going down the mountain. Not yet. The winter was not done with them, and there was still work, and there were still sick families, and the Colburn father was coming in 5 days to learn a thing that needed to be learned before the ground thawed. There were still things to do here, real things, things that mattered. But she thought about it. Corin, from across the fire, without looking up from the moss she was harvesting. "I know what you're thinking. I know you do." "And?" Brenna looked at the fire. "And spring is coming." Corin was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, "Yes, it is." The fire burned on. Outside, the snow was still deep, and the cold was still real, and the winter had weeks left in it yet. But the rye was growing. The squash was on the floor of the secondary chamber, round and heavy and certain. The moss spread green along the north wall, persistent as their mother had said, persistent as they had been, as they were going to keep being. Spring was coming. They had made it that far. They would make it the rest of the way. The Colburn father's name was Thomas, and he arrived 5 days later with a younger man named Pell Dancy, who had the hands of someone who had been working ground since he was old enough to hold a tool, and the expression of someone who had been told to keep his opinions to himself on this particular trip and was making a genuine effort. Thomas Colburn stopped just inside the cave entrance and did what everyone did. Went still, felt the warmth, looked at the growing plots. But he did it differently from the others. He did it the way a farmer looks at another farmer's field, with a specific technical attention that moved from the overall picture down to the details, assessing soil color and plant health, and spacing with the same instinct he used on his own ground. He crouched down beside the main rye bed without asking, and pressed 2 fingers into the soil at the edge of the plot, and worked them into the second knuckle and then drew them out and rubbed the soil between his fingers and looked at it. "You amended this heavy," he said. "The native soil was clay-dense," Brenna said. "High alkaline content from the limestone. It took 6 weeks of amendment before the rye would germinate reliably." "What did you use?" "Limestone particulate from the wall, organic matter from the ravine floor, fire ash mixed with water for pH balance." Thomas rubbed the soil between his fingers again. "How long before the amendment held?" 3 weeks before the structure was stable enough to plant into. Another 2 before germination rates were consistent. She paused. "The geothermal gradient does most of the temperature work. The amendment work is for nutrient content and drainage. 2 separate problems." He looked up at her. He was a straightforward man in his 40s, with a face that showed its history clearly. Cold seasons and hard harvests, and more recently, the specific weathering of a winter that had gone past what he was built for. "I owe you an apology," he said. He said it the way farmers say difficult things, plainly, without performance, looking directly at her. "My family was on that street in January. I didn't say anything." Brenna looked at him for a moment. "I know. I've been trying to figure out how to live with that." "Is that going well?" He gave a short, humorless breath that was not quite a laugh. "Not particularly." "Then stop trying to live with it and do something useful with it instead," she said. Not unkindly, just directly. "You're here. That's a start. Learn this. Take it back. Teach it to everyone who'll listen. That's more useful than living with it." He held her look. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was something in it that was not irony and not submission, but a kind of simple recognition, the way you say it to someone who has just said the truest thing in the room. They got to work. What? She taught him for 2 full days. Corin ran the secondary chamber and kept the operation going while Brenna walked Thomas and Pell Dancy through everything. The amendment ratios, the planting depths, the reflector system, the moss cultivation, the geothermal logic and how to identify it in limestone formations, the drainage requirements, the germination markers, what healthy root development looked like versus what it looked like when something was wrong. She taught it the way her mother had taught her things, without condescension, with high expectations, and with the specific generosity of someone who believes that knowledge becomes more valuable when it's shared, not less. Pell Dancy, who had been silent for most of the first day, asked his first question on the morning of the second day. It was a good question, specific and practical, about whether the amendment ratios needed to change for a south-facing site with different drainage characteristics. Brenna answered it in full, and then asked him one back about the soil conditions he'd observed at the South Meadow site, and he answered with more precision than she'd expected, and they spent the next hour going back and forth in the particular focused way of 2 people who are finding out they understand the same things from different angles. Thomas watched this and said nothing, but he was smiling slightly by the end of it. When they left on the second afternoon, their packs were loaded with prepared soil amendment materials, seed starts from the rye and turnip beds, enough to establish a trial plot at the meadow site, and 12 pages of notes in Brenna's handwriting that covered everything she'd told them, and several things she'd thought of in the night and added before dawn. She'd written it knowing that the notes would be read by more people than Thomas and Pell, would be passed around and referenced and probably argued over, and she'd written them accordingly, clear, concrete, without assuming knowledge the reader might not have. Thomas paused at the entrance slot before going through. He looked back at the cave one more time. He looked at it the way you look at something you want to make sure you've actually seen and not just processed. The rye beds, the moss wall, the small fire, the 2 sleeping mats, the stone shelf, and the tool wall, and the tin cup on its hook. All of it built with a skinning knife, a small axe, a length of rope, and 112 days. My wife asked me to tell you, he said, that the bread we got in February was the best she'd eaten in 2 years. He went through the slot before Brenna could figure out what to do with that, which she thought was probably deliberate, and she stood for a moment in the warmth of the cave and let it land, this small, specific, ordinary kindness, the best bread in 2 years, and felt something in her chest do a thing that was not dramatic and did not need to be. Corin, from the secondary chamber. What did he say? That his wife liked the bread. A pause. That's nice? Yes, Brenna said. It is. Spring did not arrive all at once. It never does in the upper mountain range, where winter releases its hold the way stubborn people release arguments, slowly, with reversals, with weeks of apparent progress followed by a late snow that sets everything back and makes you doubt you were right about the season turning at all. There was a storm in what should have been early March that put 2 feet of new snow in the ravine and dropped the temperature back to midwinter levels for 6 days. And Brenna lay on her sleeping mat on the second night of it and felt the cave hold its warmth around her and thought, this is still enough. Whatever happens outside, this is still enough. The storm broke. The melt began again, slower than before, water running in the ravine in thin, cold threads that thickened over the following weeks into something with real current. The snow on the ravine walls receded by inches, then by feet. One morning, Corin went out to check the snare line and came back without going to the snares at all, just stood inside the entrance with an expression on her face that Brenna hadn't seen in months. What? Brenna said. Come outside, Corin said. She came outside. The sky above the ravine was blue. Not the flat, pressurized blue of cold, clear days, but the particular deep and genuine blue that means the season has actually decided to change this time. The blue that has warmth behind it. The spruce above were dripping. Somewhere above the rim a bird was making noise. A real bird, not a cold weather bird, something that had come back for the season. They stood in the ravine and looked up at the sky. 138 days, Brenna said. You've been counting. I've always been counting. Corin tipped her head back further, looking at the blue. We should go down, she said. Not with urgency. Just as a statement of fact, the way she made most statements. I know. Not today, but soon. I know, Brenna said again. She kept looking at the sky. The bird above kept going. The water ran in the ravine. The world was, slowly and without ceremony, deciding to be warm again. They went down 11 days later. Not forever. They were clear about that with each other and did not need to discuss it at length. The cave was not a place they were leaving. It was a place they were expanding from. The cave was the center of something now, a working agricultural system that still needed tending and would need it through the spring planting season and beyond. They were not abandoning it. They were choosing, for the first time, to move between it and the world below. Elias walked down with them. He had offered, and they had accepted without making a thing of it, because his knowing the route was practical, and because he had been the thread between the two worlds all winter, and it was right that he be the one to walk them back. The path down the mountain was different from the path they'd taken up it in January. Physically different. The blizzard trail they'd made had been swallowed by snow months ago, and what they walked now was the proper spring-soft version of the same route, the creek bed just audible below, the trees opening up ahead to show the valley. But it was different in another way, too, a way that had nothing to do with the trail and everything to do with the people walking it, who were not the same people who had walked it in the other direction on a January morning with 2 packs and 5 days of dried meat. Brenna thought about this as she walked, about what changes a person and what doesn't. She thought about the version of herself who had stood in the doorway on that morning and looked at her uncle's face and filed away the expression she found there and said nothing. And she thought about the version of herself who had sat across a fire from that same man, 107 days later, and told him to put the sketchbook in his pack for Elias to carry. She thought about the space between those two moments and what had happened in it. What had happened was, she had found out what she was built for. not in the triumphant sense. Not the story of a person who discovers their strength and is thereafter confident and whole and no longer troubled by the things that troubled them before. That was not the kind of story life actually told. What she had found out was quieter and more durable than that she had specific knowledge and specific capability, and that when those things were fully engaged in a real problem with real stakes, in conditions that did not forgive mistakes, she did not break. She bent, and she got tired, and she got scared in the night sometimes, and she lost her temper over the soil quality and cried once, briefly, on day 30 when the turnips weren't germinating on schedule, and she couldn't see why. All of those things. And she kept going. That was not a small thing to know about yourself. Dunmore Hollow looked the same from the trail above it, and different when she walked into it. The same in the ways that small mountain towns always look the same. The layout, the buildings, the mill, the particular way the main street ran between the two tallest structures and funneled the afternoon light. Different in the way that a place looks different when you have been away from it long enough to see it, instead of just recognizing it. She saw the winter's damage clearly now, the depleted woodpiles, the sagging section of the Priestley fence line, where snow load had got to it, the general look of things that have been maintained under pressure rather than maintained well. She saw the people more clearly, too. Mrs. Colburn was in her doorway when they came down the main street, and she looked at Brenna and Corin with an expression that was so direct and uncomplicated in its relief that it was almost startling. She said, "You're all right." Not as a question, as a confirmation of something she'd been needing to confirm. "We're all right," Brenna said. The Colburn girl was on her mother's hip, the youngest, the one who had been sick in February. She looked at Brenna with the absolute frankness of very young children and then hid her face in her mother's collar, then looked again. Pell Dancy was across the street with two other men, and he nodded when he saw them, the nod of someone who had shared work with them and felt that the work established something. Brenna nodded back. Mrs. Thorne came out of her house 3 doors down when she heard the movement on the street, and she was older than Brenna had imagined from Elias's descriptions, small and sharp-eyed and moving with the deliberate care of someone who had been ill recently and was still finding the edges of her full capacity. She looked at both sisters with the professional assessment of a woman who had been the town's only healer for 30 years and therefore had spent 30 years looking at people and seeing past whatever surface they were presenting. "The Cave Moss compound?" she said, by way of greeting. "Our mother's formulation," Brenna said. "She was a careful woman." "She was. I'd like to understand the preparation properly. When you have time." "I'll make time," Brenna said. She meant it immediately and completely, the way she meant things when they were straightforwardly right. Elder Prent was not on the street. Brenna noticed his absence and did not comment on it, and it did not matter. What mattered was that she was standing on the main street of Dunmore Hollow in the early spring light, which was thin still and cool, but genuinely present, genuinely warm at its edges. And the town was not what it had been in January, not in the ways that counted. The people looking at her were not the people who had stood in their windows and watched her go, or they were those people and also different ones, carrying the winter's weight and what it had shown them about what they'd been willing to accept. And most of them were not yet sure how to hold all of that, and were not going to be sure for some time. She understood that. She was not sure how to hold it all either. Harlan Vale was at the far end of the street. He had not come forward when she arrived. He had stayed at his end, and she understood why. He was giving her the choice, which was the right thing to give her, the first actively right thing in a long series of wrong ones. She could walk past him. She could acknowledge him from a distance and nothing more. She could make any number of choices, and he was standing there not asking for any particular one. She walked toward him. He looked like a man who had been inside a hard winter and a harder reckoning simultaneously, and the combination had done its work on him. He stood straight still, but the straightness was effort rather than ease. He watched her come and didn't move and didn't change his expression, because whatever was on his face had been there for a while and was too settled to shift quickly. She stopped in front of him. Up close, he looked older than January. Not just the winter, something else. The specific aging that happens when a person has been forced to see themselves clearly and hasn't been able to look away. "The sketchbook got there, he said. It did. I should have. It was always yours. Hers, and then yours. Yes, she said simply. He looked at the ground for a moment, then back at her face. Thomas Colburn says the South Meadow site should be workable by mid-April. He's already started the soil amendment process. I know, he wrote to tell me. He thinks, a lot of people think you should be the one teaching the spring planting method, not just writing it down, actually teaching it. I know that too. He was quiet. She let him be quiet. She had not come to this end of the street to make it easier for him, but she had not come to make it harder either. She had come because the sketchbook deserved an acknowledgement, and because her mother would have thought it mattered to acknowledge it, and because she had spent 4 months building something real in a cave, and the reality of what she'd built had given her a kind of solidity she intended to keep. I don't know how to fix it, he said. Not asking for help, just being honest, which was, she thought, something he was learning to do. You can't fix it, she said. You can do better with what's in front of you. That's all anyone can do with the things they've already done wrong. He looked at her. His jaw worked. You sound like your mother. Good, she said. She was usually right. She held his look for one more moment, and then she turned and went back up the street to where Corin was standing with Elias and Mrs. Thorne, talking about the cave moss preparation in the practical, focused way of people who have identified a problem they intend to solve together, and she walked into that conversation and let it take her, and did not look back. The South Meadow cold frame went in on the 14th of April. It was Brenna's design, Thomas Colburn's labor, and Pell Dancy's soil preparation. And by the end of the first week, there were 12 people working it, learning the amendment ratios, learning to read the light conditions, learning the planting depths and the germination markers, and the difference between soil that was ready and soil that needed more time. Brenna moved among them and answered questions and corrected mistakes without making the corrections feel like failures, the way her mother had done. And when something worked, when the first seedlings broke the surface of the meadowbed, and the person who had planted them crouched down to look, she felt the same satisfaction she'd felt in the cave on day 18, watching Corin adjust the reflector. The thing about teaching, she was finding, was that it multiplied what you knew. Not in the abstract sense of spreading knowledge, though that was true too, but in the specific sense that explaining a thing required understanding it more completely than simply doing it. And the questions people asked, Thomas's questions, Pell's questions, the questions of the younger men who'd come out to the meadow with a mixture of skepticism and hunger to learn something that might actually be useful, those questions pushed her to understand her own methods more precisely than she'd had to when it was just her and Corin in the cave. Corin had said something about this on a morning when they walked down together from the cave and stood at the meadow plot edge, watching the work. You're better at it than I thought you'd be. The teaching? With people. You were always... Corin paused, finding the word. You were always careful in town, held back. I was afraid of making things worse, Brenna said. I know, but you're not doing that now. Brenna looked at the plot, at Pell explaining the reflector angle to a younger man who was listening carefully. I think I stopped worrying about whether they liked me, she said. Somewhere in the cave. I stopped having energy for that, and I never quite picked it back up. Corin was quiet for a moment. That might be the most useful thing the winter gave you. The winter gave us a lot of things. It did, but most of them required the hard part first. That was the truest thing that could be said about it, and they both knew it, and they stood at the edge of the meadow in the April light and let it be true without embellishing it. They spent the rest of their lives on the mountain, not always in the cave. The cave became one node in something larger, a system of connected growing operations that eventually included the meadow cold frame, 2 additional geothermal sites they identified in subsequent years using Voss's survey and their own accumulated knowledge, and eventually a demonstration greenhouse at the hollow's edge that families came to from valleys further afield, wanting to learn what the Vale sisters were teaching. They kept a room in town eventually, slept there in the worst winters when the cave access was difficult. But the cave was always the center, the warm north wall with its moss colony, the rye bed in the main plot, the secondary chamber where the squash had flourished that first impossible winter. Mrs. Thorne and Brenna spent 3 years compiling their mother's medicinal notebook into something more complete, cross-referencing it with Thorne's own 30 years of observation. That work outlasted both of them, got copied, got carried into other valleys by the families who learned from them. Elias Reed, who had come looking for them on a trap line and not expected to find them, stayed in the northwest range. He built a proper cabin eventually, within walking distance of the ravine. He kept the trap line. He kept coming to the cave in all seasons, not to carry food anymore, but for the same reason anyone returns to a place where the most important thing they've done happened to them. He never said this directly. He didn't need to. Thomas Colburn's youngest daughter, the one who had been sick in February, the one who had looked at Brenna from her mother's hip with the frank assessment of a small child, grew up helping with the meadow operation and eventually knew more about cold climate soil amendment than almost anyone in the region. She was the one who eventually wrote down the full teaching method, organized it properly, made it something that could be passed on without either sister being present to explain it. She had, people said, a particular way of explaining difficult things simply, without making the listener feel the difficulty. They said she got it from Brenna Vale. Harlan Vale lived 8 more years. He was not remade into a better man in any clean or satisfying sense. He was a man who had done a wrong thing and knew it and lived with that knowledge, which showed in him in the way that knowledge shows, as a kind of permanent tiredness behind the eyes and a tendency to do more than was required of him in practical matters, as if practical usefulness was what he had left to offer. He came to the cave twice more, both times to help with something specific, both times saying little beyond what the work required. The second time, Corin offered him tea, the dried herb mixture she made now, with cave moss and the wild bergamot they'd identified in their 3rd summer, and he took it and sat by the fire, and they were quiet together in the way of people who have no remaining quarrel and not much to say, and have accepted that both things are true at once. He died in the autumn of the 8th year. He died in the house where he had packed 2 bags the night before a blizzard, which Brenna knew and thought about once, carefully, and then put aside. She went to the burial. She stood at the edge of the gathering and did not speak, because she did not have the right words and did not want to use wrong ones, but she was there. Corin stood beside her. He said, "There is something that nobody talks about much when they tell stories about people who built something out of nothing in hard circumstances, which is that the building doesn't make the hard circumstances not have happened." The winter was still the winter. The January morning was still January. The second ridge in the blizzard was still worse than the first, and the dried meat was still gone by day 6. And Corin still snared her first rabbit on day 9 with a complicated feeling that lasted 30 seconds before hunger resolved it. None of that gets retroactively improved by what came after. What came after was real. The teaching was real. The cold frames and the geothermal sites and the compiled medical notebook and the knowledge that settled into the valley like a long rain, slow and pervasive, changing the ground it touched. All of it real, all of it built from something actual rather than invented. But Brenna Vale never stopped knowing that she would not have found the cave if she hadn't been forced toward it. She did not spend much time on this. It was not a productive thought, and she was a productive person. But she knew it, held it the way you hold a stone that is sharp on one side, carefully, with full awareness of what it is, not putting it down because it is sharp, but not pretending it isn't sharp either. What she had come to understand over years of teaching people who arrived with seeds and questions, and the particular look of individuals who needed to believe that difficult conditions could still produce something worth having, was this: being right about the possibilities does not protect you from the cost of getting there. The cost is real. It does not become unreal in hindsight, but the cost and the building are both true simultaneously, and you get to carry both of them. And what you do with the carrying is the only part that remains yours to choose. She had chosen to build. She kept choosing it every day for the rest of her life. When they died, Corin first, in the early winter of a quiet year, in the cave on the warm north wall, with the moss still growing green beside her. Brenna, 11 months later, in the first autumn cold, in the room in town with the mountain visible from the window, the whole valley came. Not to mourn, exactly. Or not only to mourn, they came the way people come to the places and people that taught them the things they still use every day, with a complicated gratitude that doesn't have a clean name, that is made up of equal parts grief and recognition and the specific debt you feel towards someone who gave you knowledge that kept your children alive. Thomas Colburn's daughter spoke. She said what she'd been given and where it came from and what she intended to do with it. She said it plainly, without ornament, the way she'd been taught. The cave was not sealed up or left behind. It kept growing. The rye bed in the main chamber was replanted the following spring by the people who had learned to replant it, and the moss colony on the north wall kept its slow, patient spread, and the secondary chamber with its fissure of overhead light kept receiving that midday column of sun. The sketchbook was kept in the town's small library, such as it was. A room in the Colburn house, shelved with the medical notebook and the teaching documents, and a copy of Calder Voss's geological survey that someone had thought to make. The last page was the one people looked at most. The mountain's northwest quadrant, the limestone formations, the two penciled words. They'll find it. The cold frames spread through the valley over the following decades, the method adapting to different sites and different hands while keeping its essential logic. Families that had never heard the sisters' names used the amendment ratios without knowing where they came from, the way you use a tool that has been in the family long enough that its origin is no longer the point. That was what Brenna had wanted in the end. Not the credit, the continuity. The knowledge still working after she was gone to do it, in ground she'd never seen, in hands she'd never held, through winters she'd never lived to see but had, in some small and permanent way, helped make survivable. The mountain kept its warmth in its hidden places. The rye kept growing.